Hello comrades, it's TheFinnishBolshevik. In this video I'm gonna be doing a review of all the books by historian Vladimir Brovkin. I am of course very interested in the history of the Soviet Union and the history of communism and the working class movement in general, so I think it is very useful to read history books about it. People frequently ask me like, okay, who's a good historian, what's a good history book on this, that or the other you would recommend, especially on the Soviet Union. The vast majority of history books out there are of course written by anti-communists and I wouldn't recommend them, but the only way to really find out is to read them. So I kind of plan to go through the works of a lot of different historians. Of course there's historians who are famous and more influential and whatnot, so I sometimes prioritize those. I do want to make a review of E.H. Carr's works. E.H. Carr, of course, is a very influential historian, but the thing is that he has so many books that it's taking me quite a long time to read all of them. Of course, another more contemporary influential historian is Orlando Figes. I do want to talk about his works as well at some point. But anyway, let's get to the topic at hand. So, Vladimir Brovkin, he has written 6 books, I believe. They're all about the Soviet Union, mostly about the Lenin era, and they mostly talk about the Mensheviks, or the relation between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, and generally various anti-Bolshevik tendencies during the Lenin era. He does venture outside of that a little bit, but Menshevism is clearly his main focus. And when I was reading his stuff, I kind of stumbled upon this whole genre of like Menshevik history, and maybe I'll make a separate video about that as well at some point. Generally, I think it's very useful to read a lot because, you know, if you read stuff, you learn about stuff. It's just that, of course, time is limited. There's a lot of stuff out there, so you kind of have to maybe prioritize a little bit. But anyway, so Brovkin, he's an anti-communist historian. He has some ideas that are a little bit unique. His main premise, or the thing that is mostly associated with him, I think, is this idea that the Bolsheviks lost all of their popularity almost immediately after gaining power, and that really the Mensheviks were much more popular than the Bolsheviks, which I think most historians in the field wouldn't say that. That's quite an unusual statement for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, everybody knows that the Bolsheviks, they gained the majority in the Second Congress of Soviets and carried out the October Revolution. And they also won the Civil War, so how could they have won if they didn't have any popularity? And, you know, the Mensheviks kind of just pretty quickly fizzle out, and you don't really hear much about them, and the whole topic of Menshevism is quite niche and obscure, so it just seems weird to claim that, oh yeah, the Mensheviks were actually much more popular, and yada yada. So he also has some other ideas that are a bit unique. Of course, none of these ideas are absolutely unique. There's some other writers who have written somewhat similar stuff. I forget who wrote Origins of the Communist Autocracy. That's from the 1950s. I think that might have been the first full-length book dedicated to this idea that the Bolsheviks were supposedly like really unpopular and that the Mensheviks or some other similar groups were actually much more popular. Brovkin, he started writing in the 1980s, I think. So there were other people already writing stuff like that a little bit before. He actually met a bunch of the members of the Menshevik party, which might be a little bit surprising to some people because Menshevism was a thing in like the early 1900s, and then after the 1920s, it pretty much just completely disappeared. Like, the party actually was around, although only in, I think, Germany in the 30s until Hitler's rise to power, and then I think they went to America and they kinda existed there during the 40s, and after that they pretty much just completely disappeared. But some members of the Menshevik party, I think, lived into the 1960s and 1970s. So Brovkin actually met a bunch of those people and they gave him a bunch of materials. They gave him like Menshevik newspapers and Menshevik writings and basically these big archives of stuff, basically Menshevik propaganda. So I think that inspired Brovkin to start writing because he basically just started parroting Menshevik propaganda against the Bolsheviks. That's really what a lot of his articles are like. And his first book, Mensheviks After October, that's from 1987, I think. And in that book, he basically just expands on this idea that, oh yeah, the Mensheviks were actually much more popular than the Bolsheviks. pretty much the whole book is just about the fact that he claims that the Mensheviks regained all their popularity right after the October Revolution, and then the Civil War starts, and then he says that the Mensheviks split or various things happen to them. And that's pretty much the entire book. If you look at his works about this topic, you'll see that the vast majority of sources are just Menshevik propaganda, sometimes right SR propaganda, sometimes white guard propaganda, but they're all very bad sources. I also don't agree with his whole narrative of the split in the Mensheviks, because I think he claims that the Mensheviks were disunited and that was like a weakness of theirs. But I don't really fully accept that. I think the Menshevik right wing openly collaborated with the whites during the Civil War all the time, while the Menshevik left wing claimed to not support the whites. So then the Bolsheviks allowed them to exist legally, but there wasn't such a clear-cut distinction between Menshevik left and Menshevik right. Like the Menshevik lefts always made propaganda saying that the Civil War should be terminated, that the Red Army should stop what they're doing, basically making defeatist propaganda, trying to hinder the Red Army's war effort, and they also constantly defend the Menshevik rights. So it's not like there's an anti-Bolshevik wing of the Mensheviks and then there's a pro-Bolshevik wing of the Mensheviks. No, they're all anti-Bolshevik. It's just that they use different strategies. One side is openly advocating for armed counter-revolution, while the other group is kind of covertly doing that. So Mensheviks After October, I think it's just fundamentally not a good book. Like, I think the main message of it is just completely wrong. Like, there's a reason why nobody else even thought of that. Like, why, even though the whole field is full of anti-communists, none of them even thought that they could possibly claim that the Mensheviks were so much more popular than the Bolsheviks or something. It's just absurd. Although I've seen some more recent history writing, like cite Brovkin. There's no new research on this topic as far as I know, but I've seen that Brovkin is cited a little bit more these days. And it's actually quite interesting. I think the field, like, you would expect that the scholarship gets better with time, since more research is being done, they have access to more sources and whatnot, but like, actually in some ways I think this research gets worse, because if you read E.H. Carr, for instance, the stuff he says is way more reasonable than a lot of the stuff that people say later. And that's because the field of Soviet history is so anti-communist that when someone invents some anti-communist argument, everybody starts saying it. So as time goes on, they just invent more stuff. So first they of course just say that, okay, the Bolsheviks are just bad, they're terrorists and whatnot. Then they start saying that they're German agents, and then they start saying that actually the Mensheviks were more popular, and then they start saying that actually also the anarchists were more popular, and then as time goes on, they just come up with more and more of this BS, basically, and none of it is true. So then the field just keeps getting more and more far right as time goes on, just because they have more time to invent new slanders, basically, against Bolshevism. So yeah, I think the whole premise of the book is just completely wrong. The sources are terrible. Like, it just makes absolutely no sense. Like, how could this pass peer review? Like, it's a disgrace. Like, it's absurd. I might be getting this mixed up with another Brovkin book or another book by one of his collaborators, but I think it is this one where they claim that they have archival sources, because originally they of course only had the Menshevik newspapers, and that was pretty much the only source. Is like, oh yeah, the Mensheviks themselves claim that they were always right and they were always so popular and the Bolsheviks sucked. And the source is just Mensheviks themselves, which is not a reliable source. But then later they started saying like, oh, actually we have some archival sources too. And I was like, oh really? And then I checked that, and the archival source was just more Menshevik newspapers, however, kept at an archive somewhere. To me, that is just sneaky as hell. Like, imagine, like, when I think of an archival source, I think it's like some kind of government document or something, but no, it's just the same Menshevik newspapers, but they're just kept at a Russian archive. It's very dishonest. But anyway, moving on, the second book, it's called Dear Comrades, Menshevik Reports on the Bolshevik Revolution and the Civil War, which is actually quite interesting. It's kind of giving us some primary sources. It's a collection of Menshevik documents, so that's kind of cool. The documents themselves, they are pretty much as one might expect. Some of them are letters from one Menshevik to another. Some of them are articles, some of them are speeches given to the Second International abroad. Some of them are quite interesting, like for instance in the documents Menshevik leader Dan and some other, these so-called left Mensheviks, they just whine and complain that the October Revolution is a disaster and a catastrophe and that it should never have happened, and then they whine that like the workers are stupid, the workers don't follow them, why are the workers waging a revolution, they shouldn't do that, and like then there's documents where Tsereteli and other right Mensheviks talk about defensism, why it's necessary to support imperialism. The most hilarious parts are the parts which Brovkin himself is most impressed by, and those parts are things like Mensheviks calling the Bolsheviks murderers and killers and etc. The Mensheviks accused the Bolsheviks of being killers of workers because of suppression of revolts launched by the Mensheviks themselves, while of course totally forgetting their own actions, for example during the July days when the government that Mensheviks participated in massacred workers, or the July offensive when the government that Mensheviks were part of launched this huge offensive which was a terrible failure and tons of people died, and they also reintroduced the death penalty at the front, so if people didn't want to attack they would be executed. And ignoring World War I in general, like the Mensheviks thought that top priority is participate in the war even though it was ruining the country, killing millions of people. The Mensheviks demand that the Second International condemn the Bolsheviks who have supposedly betrayed socialism and are committing violence against workers, etc. It's just the hypocrisy is taken to absolutely unimaginable levels. And Brovkin, he says that what the Mensheviks say is very profound and very true, which is just kind of shows where his head is at. And another thing which I noticed and thought was very interesting is that the Mensheviks constantly slander and attack the Red Guards and the revolutionary soldiers, calling them robbers and criminals and calling them lumpen proletarians instead of workers and peasants, and calling them sans-culottes from the French Revolution, as if that's a bad thing. Sans-culottes, of course, were the poor people in the French Revolution. Generally, the Mensheviks use this very kind of elitist and anti-revolutionary language, like, if the workers and soldiers, if they carry out revolution, they call them sans-culottes and criminals. If the peasants carry out revolution, they call them Pugachevshchina or something. Pugachev, of course, was a leader of a famous peasant uprising. As if that's a bad thing. The Mensheviks complained that when the Constituent Assembly met, Tsereteli was heckled, and that it seemed more like a pub, which, they just sound like a bunch of bourgeois gentlemen rather than Marxist revolutionaries. Brovkin says that some of these statements were not intended for publication, but really they couldn't have been very secret or very not intended for publication, because Trotsky quotes practically identical statements. I just happened to notice that. I was reading Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and he quotes left Menshevik Suhanov, who says, quote, "We only have to get into the good society of Mariinsky Palace in order to revive at once the atmosphere of the low-class saloon," unquote. But basically, I think the bulk of the documents published in this are they're Menshevik newspaper articles, which are not to be trusted. They're very dishonest. And there's also Menshevik speeches to the Second International, which are equally dishonest. Then the third book, Behind the Front Lines of the Civil War, Political Parties and Social Movements in Russia, 1918 to 1922. In this, Brovkin, he takes a step further to the right, and he also puts forward another of his more unique views or original views. Like in his earliest work, he mostly just regurgitates whatever the Menshevik says, so it almost feels like he is a Menshevik, although he repeatedly says that he isn't one, and that he doesn't support any kind of socialism, but that if he was a socialist, he would support Menshevism rather than Bolshevism. But in this book, it becomes more clear that he's much more right-wing than the Mensheviks. It almost feels like Solzhenitsyn, because Solzhenitsyn basically has this very anti-urban, anti-intellectual sentiment. And of course, Solzhenitsyn also has a Slavophile sentiment, where he basically says that the peasants, they are uneducated and they are very superstitious and religious, and that's good, and that the peasants are the only ones who really know what's what. It kind of feels like that. And Brovkin, he basically claims that whatever the Reds were doing in the Civil War and whatever the Whites were doing, that's kind of irrelevant. That was very irrelevant to the average Russian. And he says that the average real Russian was just a peasant who didn't give a shit about anything. And that he does try to say that the whites were good, or he tries to say a number of times that people greeted the whites as liberators from Bolshevik tyranny, etc., etc., which is just absurd. That simply is not accurate. First of all, it's unimaginable, considering that the whites, they had all the professional soldiers, all the army commanders were almost all the army commanders were on the side of the whites. So they had all the military technical skills, they had better weapons, they also had the support of all the foreign powers and all the money. And then the foreign powers, 14 countries even intervened and invaded Russia on the side of the whites and helped arm and fund the whites. It's unimaginable. How could the Bolsheviks have won if they didn't have anything? They didn't have any allies, military or technical skill or expertise, and they also supposedly didn't have any popularity. So what did they have then? How is it possible? It's just not. So, although Brovkin tries to claim that the whites were kind of good and the people kind of liked the whites and the people really hated the Reds, he doesn't go that route fully. Instead, what he says is that he claims that most people in the Civil War were neutral. He says that the most powerful faction in the Civil War were not Reds, were not Whites, or any other such army, but instead they were Greens. And Greens, well, again, this is another one of those things most people who have read something about Soviet history or Russian history or history in general have never heard about the Greens. So it kind of raises the question, could the Greens really have been so significant if nobody has even ever heard about them? Well, the answer is clearly not. But basically, whenever somebody deserted from the White Army, or if somebody deserted from the Red Army and they hid in the forests with guns, they were called Greens. Or if any peasant groups just got weapons, they were called Greens. Or any armed bands, any robbers, any bandits, they were all called Greens. Sometimes, if you read Gladkov's famous novel Cement, they talk about Red Greens. That's talking about anti-white partisans or red partisans. Sometimes anti-Bolshevik partisans were called White Greens. So sometimes Greens could be anti-Bolshevik, sometimes they could be pro-Bolshevik. I think Feiges in his book Peasant Russia says that the people who deserted from the Whites basically never went back, and a lot of times they joined the Red Army, whereas people who deserted from the Red Army sometimes went back to the Red Army. So you can't really equate Red Greens or White Greens and whatnot. And I also think it's very misleading to say that the Greens were the strongest faction, because the Greens were not a unified group. Every group of bandits were called Greens, and every group of deserters were called Greens, even if they had nothing in common with each other. There was no such thing as a Green Army. There was no unified force called the Greens. The Greens are a phenomena and kind of a mental construction, but they were not a political faction. That's why nobody even knows about them. So I think this whole green thing is like a very Solzhenitsyn-esque argument, but it's just fundamentally false. It just doesn't hold up. Because Brovkin, he basically wants to claim that the Bolsheviks won without any popularity, which is just impossible. He claims that there was no worker-peasant alliance, and he kind of tries to just ignore the fact that pretty much everybody else has figured out, which is that, of course, the core supporters of the Bolsheviks were workers, and then in the countryside, the poor peasants, the semi-proletarians, landless peasants, farm laborers, those were the core who supported the Bolsheviks. There's actually quite a lot of good statistical data about that. Basically, Brovkin claims that whenever the Reds attacked, it didn't do anything unless there were peasant rebellions against the Whites in the White rear, and then that would cause damage to the Whites, and then the Reds would just sweep in and win. And vice versa, if there were peasant rebellions in the Red territory, then that would damage the Reds, and then the Whites would advance and win. Which, yeah, I'm sure that's true, but what pretty much every other historian realizes is that the whites wanted to restore the power of the landlords. They wanted to take the land away from the peasants. They wanted to undo the land reform and also do a bunch of other stuff that the peasants really hated. But that was the most important. They wanted to take the peasants' land away, whereas the Reds didn't want to do that. The Reds wanted to get rid of the landlords and wanted to carry out the land reform. Both sides did certain things that the peasants didn't like, such as conscription, requisition of food, requisition of horses, etc. But since both sides were doing it, that was kind of default. That kind of cancels itself out. The biggest difference between the Reds and the Whites was that the Whites wanted to take the land away from the peasants, which they definitely hated, whereas the Reds didn't. So the peasants, every time if they had to choose, they would choose the Reds. And that is why the peasants resisted the Whites a lot harder than they resisted the Reds. And that is why the peasants sided with the Reds a lot more than they sided with the Whites. And there is actually quite a lot of good research being done about that. It's actually quite a well-studied phenomena. Another interesting thing is that in this book, Brovkin literally accuses all his critics and all the people who disagree with him, and also all the people from the so-called revisionist school of Soviet history, people like Lin Viola, Arch Getty. He accuses them all of being Marxists and neo-Marxists, which again is quite reminiscent of Solzhenitsyn. Brovkin claims that he is dismantling myths by simply reasserting the most stereotypical and tired Cold Warrior views. Because in his mind, the idea that the Bolsheviks had some level of popularity and that the peasants preferred the Reds, he believes that that's a complete myth being perpetuated by academia, which he considers to be full of Marxists. You know, it's a Jordan Peterson level talking point. After that, we have the fourth book called Bolsheviks in Russian Society. That he actually edited instead of writing it. I saw some contemporary reviews about this book, which just were very negative, even though they were written by other people in mainstream anti-communist academia, and they just said that it's just a bunch of tired Cold War propaganda. It doesn't really come up with anything new, and it's just trying to oppose the revisionist school, because the revisionist school of Soviet history thought that they need to analyze more like society as a whole and what the people are doing, instead of only focusing on the top government leaders. So to try to write more like a social history instead of, during the Cold War there was this thing called the totalitarian paradigm, which means that the historians focus only on what Stalin is doing, and they picture Stalin as like this all-powerful dictator who decides everything, and everything that happens is always just Stalin's idea and Stalin has planned everything. Whereas the revisionist school thinks that things are much more chaotic, that a lot of times things happen because of more complicated reasons, and then the government is not necessarily behind it all, and the government is only kind of reacting. And the revisionist school is also anti-communist, but it's just a different kind of anti-communist, and it's in a sense much more reasonable. They also wanted to rely more on actual sources and evidence, whereas the totalitarian school, most infamously Robert Conquest, used extremely bad sources like rumors and Nazi propaganda and whatnot. So this book, The Bolsheviks in Russian Society, it's written after the Russian archives were partially opened, to the extent that they are open today. And it's kind of just trying to use whatever they found in the archives to vindicate the totalitarian paradigm, which is just the most mindless and stupid and ignorant version of Soviet scholarship, or scholarship about the Soviet Union. The people who contributed for this book, there's an article talking about the Russian intelligentsia, one about the left SRs, one about the right SRs, the white movement. There's different kinds of things. I think the one that stands out as maybe better, I think Pereira, his work consistently has always been much better than these other people, although I don't remember if his article in this one was particularly good, but he's talking about the Siberian warlords who were on the side of the whites, and his other stuff, at least about that topic, has been pretty good, I think. He's an anti-communist, but I don't think he really goes against the facts all that much. He doesn't claim that, oh yeah, the white warlords were fantastic guys. Like, no, he's pretty honest about what they were like. The contributions that stand out as absolutely the worst are well, it's to be honest, when you look at it, it's not very surprising. It's Richard Pipes has an article called Unpublished Lenin, and then Brovkin has an article called Bolshevik Policy Towards Women, where Brovkin claims that the Bolsheviks were sexist because, and I quote, Bolshevik feminists themselves had maintained that women workers could not separate themselves from their male comrades and that liberation could be achieved only in the context of proletarian dictatorship, unquote. Which I don't really see how that's sexist. They're just saying that you shouldn't be a bourgeois feminist, but you should just be a Marxist feminist. But Brovkin says that that's some kind of a scam to like deceive women. And then Brovkin also says that women in Russia in the early 1900s were not politically backward or more politically backward than men, but that they simply didn't know anything about politics and didn't care about politics. He says that on page 217 to 18, which is quite an interesting statement because, like, what is the difference between politically backward and not caring about politics and not knowing about politics? Of course, being politically backward is not like an inherent trait. Anybody can be politically backward. If they just don't know about politics, then again, anybody can learn and know about politics. So, you know, women at the time in Russia, they mostly didn't have a job. They didn't leave the household. They were just at home all the time, taking care of the household. And they were kind of kept marginalized and kept out of politics, hence why they didn't know about it. So it's just kind of a weird point. I don't know what he's trying to get at. Richard Pipes, when he's talking about the unpublished Lenin, he's just citing some Lenin documents where Lenin says supposedly some mean stuff. And it's not even anything interesting or surprising. It's just Lenin says, oh yeah, there's a white guard conspiracy. Well, go kill them or something. Like, it's not even remotely surprising. It's just not anything worth talking about. Then I think we have the fifth book, Russia After Lenin, from 2004, I believe. A bunch of these books have been reissued or republished, whatnot, so I hope I'm getting the years correctly. But this is more about culture, and even though it's called Russia After Lenin, it does talk about the Lenin era, but it also just talks about the NEP in general. Well, it talks about the NEP and talks about the anti-religious campaign, and it talks about the Komsomol, and it talks about policy towards women, and it also talks about, like, it rehashes the same stuff that he's already been saying, so like Menshevik action against Bolsheviks and like whatnot. But I don't know, even though it's covering a lot of different topics, it's still kind of uninteresting. I have stuff to say about it, but still, like, looking back, you know, it was a surprisingly uninteresting book. But there's some sort of interesting remarks that Brovkin makes. Like, first of all, he claims that Bolshevism is anti-Marxist, which, again, is weird. Like, he's not a Marxist himself. Why is this anti-communist defending Marxism from Bolshevism? Like, why does he care? Like, it's a weird thing. But it's something he's done consistently. He always says, like, oh yeah, the Mensheviks were the real Marxists. The Bolsheviks were bad. But that's just another of those tactics that these anti-communists use. They try to use whatever. Like, they say Marxism is bad, but if you want to be a Marxist, then be a Menshevik. So they try to, like, appeal to people on all the different kinds of grounds. He says that Bolshevism is anti-Marxist. He says that the Bolsheviks only wanted to impose their utopia on people and didn't care about people. And he claims that according to Marxism, workers shouldn't need a vanguard party. I don't know, I just think it's very touching that this, like, really hostile anti-Marxist guy, he wants to defend Marx from distortions, apparently. He claims that Lenin was an anti-Marxist and dishonest because he used his theories supposedly in a utilitarian way, by which he meant that Lenin basically didn't believe in his own theories. He gives an example. He says that proletarian internationalism is a theory which Lenin put forward because it helped class struggle, and therefore it was somehow dishonest because Lenin supported it for a practical reason and not because of some impractical and totally abstract reason. He's saying that if Lenin advocated proletarian internationalism completely in the abstract, that would be honest. But since Lenin advocated for it because it also related to practice, that somehow means that he's dishonest and he's only using it in a utilitarian way. I don't know, it's so convoluted and dumb that it's difficult to even explain. So he thinks that you should only believe things that don't affect your activity and your practical actions in any way. And if they do guide your practice, then it's somehow dishonest and you're only doing it pragmatically. I don't know, it's just so incredibly weird way of looking at it. If you seriously wanted to try to prove this point, then you would have to show how Lenin supports proletarian internationalism one day because it's advantageous, and then the next day he doesn't support it because it's disadvantageous. But of course that never happens, so he can't do that. But like, why would you advocate for a position that doesn't relate to practice in any way? If anything, you know, the Mensheviks, they only supported proletarian internationalism in the abstract, but when they actually had to apply it in real life, they went against it. And of course he claims that only the Mensheviks supported the will of the people and were real Marxists. The main point of the book is to talk about culture. He says that the Bolsheviks always failed at all of their cultural projects. He is very consistent about that. He says that the Bolsheviks basically always failed at every single thing they ever tried. He takes it to an almost absurd level. He says that the Bolsheviks tried to spread artistic culture, but that the people always just preferred mindless entertainment, like American dances, crime stories, and Tarzan. And according to Brovkin, that's a good thing and normal. So he quite literally says that the Bolsheviks were evil for trying to spread art, but luckily the people didn't like it. That's what he claims. But that's completely false. People actually do like art. And something like Repin is very popular, even to this day in Russia. And great Russian literature also is popular. And the Bolsheviks did a lot to popularize it. They increased literacy. Generally, the Bolsheviks wanted to do two things. First, they wanted to make the existing art available to the people, the best existing art, and then they wanted to create new socialist art. Brovkin claims that the Bolsheviks tried to spread science, but that the people always preferred religion and superstition, and that the priests always won all the debates against the communists. And according to Brovkin, that's good. Again, very Solzhenitsyn-esque. The message of the book is that everything has always been the same and will always remain the same. He says that the people always just want superstition, that the people are stupid, that the people's cultural level is low and will always remain low, and that the people always just want mindless entertainment and nothing more than that. And he says that that's good and proper. And he also claims that the workers hated communism and that they were just constantly drunk and anti-Semitic, and he also kind of implies that that's good. Which, well, I don't even need to say anything. I just think that he's completely wrong about all of that. And maybe because he's like so extreme, maybe that's why it also reminds me of Solzhenitsyn. Because he even claims that the wages in the USSR were much worse than they were under the Tsar, and that the workers had much worse lives in the USSR than they had under the Tsar. And he also claims that that the private economy would have actually developed the country much better, and that the private peasant economy was actually not backward in any way, and he claims that the collectivization was economically unsound, and that the Bolsheviks only did it for ideological reasons and for reasons of political power and political control. And he also claims that the state industries never made any revenue, but constantly lost money because they were socialist and thus inefficient, and that there actually never was any real NEP in industry. And he also claims that socialism completely destroyed all incentive already under the NEP and war communism. So it's just, you know, it's so extreme. Like, it just makes you wonder, like, if what he's saying is true, then how could the Bolsheviks ever have survived, stayed in power? How did anything get done? Because he says that nothing ever worked, everything always went wrong, everything just always got worse and worse and never any better. And they never did anything for any good or smart reason. They always did everything wrong and always only for like the stupidest reasons and most evil reasons. So it's quite absurd. Like, he's laying it on a bit too thick, I think. This is what he says. This is what I wrote down. Quote, Soviet state-heavy industry operated at a loss most of the time. They performed poorly because they were socialist. The very structure of Soviet industry precluded its efficiency and in fact discouraged it. There was no incentive to be profitable, as it implied harder work and no reward. Unquote. Basically, he's claiming that the private sector, the tiny itty-bitty peasant farms, they were great, fantastic, super efficient. Those people were real entrepreneurs. And that the state was just this huge parasite that was just like somehow living by just leeching off of those enterprising individuals. Because it just makes you think, like, if the whole state sector was always operating at a loss, then how did they ever, like, how did they not run out of money? But I guess he means that the tiny private plots were somehow producing such huge revenues that the state was somehow able to sustain itself off of only that, since the state sector basically never made any revenue. He also says that the collectivization was economically unprofitable. So, you know, when the private sector was eliminated and there was only the public sector, I don't understand where he thinks all the money is coming from then. Where's all the resources coming from? Because he says that there was never any incentive to be profitable. There was always only incentive to be unprofitable. So, like, how does he explain that the system ever worked even for like a week, let alone for decades and like half a century? The Tsarist economy was not the second most powerful economy in the world, but the Soviet economy was. So how does he explain that? Well, he doesn't really explain it. He also claims that the ideological differences between Trotsky, Stalin and Bukharin were actually meaningless and didn't really exist, and that they were only invented by Stalin, quote unquote, for his purposes, whatever those were. But then, you know, it raises the question, if there was no difference between Stalin and Trotsky and Bukharin, then what were these so-called purposes and agendas that they had? Was Stalin's political agenda not opposed by Trotsky and Bukharin? Looking back at it, I think Brovkin probably would say that it was only all about power, that Stalin, Trotsky and Bukharin, they didn't have any major disagreements policy-wise, but they were just competing like who gets the power, which to me is just incredibly childish. You could even claim that, okay, Trotsky didn't care about anything, or Bukharin. Like, I think Bukharin did care about certain things, although he changed his mind a lot, but there is a certain logic to how he changed his mind, and same with Trotsky, I think. But even if you did claim that they didn't care about anything and didn't have any real opinions, their views still reflected actual political currents in the country. So there had to be somebody putting forward a right-wing line, and there had to be someone putting forward an ultra-left line, because those were just real existing political trends. And even these strategic differences, like, should we not have the NEP at all? Or should we have it for a while? Or should we just have it permanently? I mean, that's a real political issue. Some people are going to say one thing, some people are going to say something else. It's just weird to say that it's like a meaningless difference. He also makes another interesting statement. He says that strikes were not supposed to happen in Soviet Russia, and the fact that there were some strikes destroyed Marxist ideology, and that Marxist ideology couldn't explain them, or that they couldn't be explained by Marxist ideology, etc. It's just such a silly statement. It was very easy for the Bolsheviks to explain immediately if there were some people who either were or claimed to be workers who opposed them. It's very easy to explain it. Either their class background was actually not proletarian, or there was some kind of specific labor aristocratic group, or some kind of specific petty bourgeois group, or people who had only recently become workers. You know, if you're a black-hungry anti-Semite or a capitalist and then you become a worker, you're not going to suddenly become some kind of hardline communist, or various other things. It's about class consciousness. Like, if this idea that some workers don't have a developed class consciousness, that's a very core idea of Bolshevism. If workers just automatically were class conscious, then you really wouldn't need a party, and you wouldn't even need Marxism, probably. Anyway, the final book. This was actually much more thought-provoking, surprisingly. It's called From Lenin to Putin. It's from 2023. Maybe it was so thought-provoking in comparison to these other ones because it covers a broader time span. It covers a lot of new ground, new topics that Brovkin previously didn't talk about. So he starts off in his usual style. He says that Tsarist Russia actually had much better conditions for workers than Soviet Russia. And he actually claims that Tsarist Russia had better conditions for workers than even Western countries, which to me is just, that's a new one, never heard that before. He says that the Tsarist Empire treated people generally equally well or better than Western countries, which, yeah, I've never heard that one before. Brovkin also claims that Russia under the Tsar was making a remarkable progress, had great economic and cultural developments, especially under Nicholas II. Even though Nicholas II is usually seen as like the sort of embodiment of total decay and degeneration of the whole society. Economically, culturally, like the whole court. If you read like Orlando Figes and his People's Tragedy, even though he is kind of like exaggerating, in my opinion, he's painting an exaggeratedly bleak picture of Russian life. Still, he is correct about the fact that the whole court was just run by like a bunch of weirdos and lunatics and like Rasputin and like all these other guys. And that the Tsar was just becoming more and more reactionary. The people wanted some kind of progressive legislation, and some people were trying to make like even some very modest reforms, and the Tsar was just not having any of it. He wanted to make things even more reactionary. Some politicians wanted some kind of reform. The Tsar said, no, I have to be like autocratic, and I have to become even more autocratic. No reforms, no constitution. Religion has to be more fundamentalist than before, not more liberal. Culture has to be more obscurantist and more primitivist and go backwards to the times before Peter the Great and whatnot, back to the Middle Ages. So you could almost make this into like a drinking game or something, or like a Brovkin bingo, like try to come up with what's the most reactionary position to have about the Soviet or Russian history on any given topic. And he probably has that. This is a thing that far-right people say sometimes, is that actually the Russian Empire was great. They were not backward at all. Their economy was booming. Their economic growth was really fast, and they would have industrialized even faster if it wasn't for the Bolsheviks. So Brovkin, of course, like advocates that in several of his books as well. In this book as well, Brovkin tries to prove that Lenin is actually not a real Marxist. This is an interesting thing. This is what he says, quote, Lenin went much further than that, so much further than Marxism, supposedly. His understanding of the term dictatorship of the proletariat meant not the dictation of policy, but an elimination of the bourgeoisie as such. Aside from the issue of state terrorism that this understanding implied, it was certainly not Marxism. Physical liquidation of the bourgeoisie was not a Marxist tenet. Total liquidation of any private property was not a Marxist idea, unquote. He claims that Lenin did not want to liquidate the bourgeoisie as a class, but physically kill all the capitalists. Well, that's not true, and that also did not happen. If he wanted to do that, then why didn't he, though? I mean, of course, some capitalists were killed, but not all of them. And it's also weird, like he says that the total abolition of private property is not a Marxist idea. In the Communist Manifesto, it says that Marxist principles can be summarized in one sentence: abolition of private property. So I don't understand like where he gets this idea from. In a different place, Brovkin writes, quote, what is remarkable about Lenin's ideas is that he was convinced that only he understood Marxism and no one else. He openly advocated the physical liquidation of entire social classes, unquote. Well, I don't know, where does he advocate that? I've never seen that. He writes, quote, Lenin wrote articles, polemicized with Karl Kautsky, attended meetings, corresponded with leading social democrats of Europe. He was not known as a great theoretician of Marxism. His polemics were rather rude and personal. In his articles, he often discussed not the issues at hand, but the personal qualities of people he criticized, unquote. I don't know, I think that's projection. Because Brovkin, in this quote, he just says that Lenin was stupid, rude. It is true that Lenin, he calls Kautsky a renegade, of course, which could be considered rude, but he doesn't just do that out of the blue. He calls Kautsky a renegade after Kautsky basically goes against all his previous principles, hence being a renegade. What kind of personal beef could he have with Kautsky? You know, his beef with Kautsky was purely political. Also, this is another thing, like here, Brovkin also takes it another step further to the right into far-right territory. He says, quote, Lenin received funding whose origin led to the general staff of the German army, unquote. So even though it's been debunked, well, it was already debunked 100 years ago, but it's been further debunked again and again. But Brovkin, he claims that the Bolsheviks were funded by the Germans and that the Bolsheviks were German agents. And I was curious about this, so I looked up the sources, or actually the source. He uses one source. So he cites a historian named Begunov, a far-right nationalist, who says that the Bolsheviks are using the methods of the Freemasons and the Illuminati. So I went to Begunov's website. There it says that his parents were aristocrats and his father was a White Guard officer who was killed by the communists. So I'm sure he's completely objective and not biased. You know, okay, Freemasons, Illuminati, gotcha. Begunov is actually quite an interesting figure. He says that modern Russia is threatened by a global Zionist Freemason conspiracy. So he seems completely not unhinged at all. As his sources, Begunov uses white generals, as well as the memoirs of Kerensky. And again, like these Kerensky's memoirs, like those have been, people have talked about them and debunked them a million times for almost a century already. He also cites the Sisson documents, which again have been debunked. Like the Sisson documents were probably debunked immediately when they were published 100 years ago, but George Kennan, of course, like debunked them in the 50s. And even if you look up the Sisson documents, even more discrepancies have been found in them. The Sisson documents are a very famous forgery, although, I mean, maybe Sisson himself didn't know that they were forgeries. But there's like, anyway, no need to get into that. So, Begunov claims that the head of the provisional government, the Russian provisional government, Prince Lvov, who was later replaced by Kerensky, he says that Prince Lvov received reliable proof of Lenin's contact with the Germans, but allegedly this proof was all somehow destroyed. He doesn't explain why Lvov never published this proof, why he didn't act on this proof, and, you know, if they had all this proof, then why did they need to fabricate the Sisson documents? He also cites as a source S.P. Melgunov, a right-wing conspirator funded by the Entente. So, extremely sketch. And Begunov says, quote, "Now hardly anyone can doubt that Lenin took German money from April 1917 to the summer of 1918, and not a small amount, 40 million according to Kerensky," unquote. Brilliant. Luckily, Kerensky is here to tell us, probably very accurate information. Very happy that you have a source as reliable as Kerensky. Begunov also tries to connect Lenin to Parvus. Parvus was basically a Trotskyist, but since World War I, Parvus had been a German chauvinist and who supported Germany in World War I, and who Lenin had always despised Parvus. When Parvus was a Trotskyist, Lenin despised him, and even afterwards, obviously when Parvus becomes a social imperialist chauvinist, Lenin despises him even more. Lenin publicly attacked Parvus consistently throughout his whole career, but Begunov tries to say that somehow Lenin and Parvus were allies, and that because Parvus was a German chauvinist, therefore Lenin is somehow connected with Germany. It's quite something. And I think this idea is not even invented by Begunov himself. I think he's getting it from, maybe Kerensky, because Lenin himself even mentions it in his own writings. But anyway, let's get back to Brovkin. So in this book, Brovkin, he just sounds, again, like Solzhenitsyn. He says that the Tsar was so great. He says the Tsar was a true Christian, that he appointed amazing individuals, real geniuses like Witt and Stolypin. And Solzhenitsyn, of course, also loved Stolypin. If you read his Red Wheel books, he praises Stolypin. So Brovkin says that the Tsar was just so great. He appointed these great guys, Stolypin, etc. But unfortunately, the Duma caused all these problems because they criticized the Tsar. So I guess it's bad to have a Duma. It would be better if they just had autocracy. Brovkin spreads all the usual lies, but he just always goes above and beyond. Like, he says that the decision to embalm Lenin was actually Stalin's idea and Stalin's decision, and that he actually says that Stalin decided that before Lenin was even dead, which I don't think I've ever heard that one before. Although maybe Trotsky was saying that, I'm not sure. It's very extreme. And Arch Getty, at least, shows quite convincingly with sources just how the idea to embalm Lenin came about and whose idea it was. I have a video about it, actually. I'll post it in the description. But the idea came about obviously only after Lenin was dead, and it came about gradually. The Lenin mausoleum actually was originally made of wood, and it was supposed to be only temporary. On page 66, Brovkin says that basically nothing ever improved under Lenin and Stalin. Everything just kept getting worse and worse all the time. And he says that even the illiteracy campaign was totally fake, and that actually the literacy never increased. And he says that in reality, the quality and even the quantity of schools was better under the Tsar. He claims that the schools under the Tsar were better and there were more of them. He says that in the 5-year plan, quote, not much was achieved, unquote. He says that all the achievements were fake, and the only real gains were factories built by foreign companies. He says that on page 89. And he says that the country was poorer in 1953 than it was in 1929. So, I don't know, like, it's very, like, paradoxical how, like, somehow nothing ever improves, but, like, it still looks like it does. And, like, they keep losing money, but somehow the money never runs out. And the country just keeps getting poorer, but somehow it's, like, becomes the second most powerful economy in the world. Like, something doesn't really add up. It's almost as if what he's saying is not true. I still find it interesting, though. I mean, of course, there are things that you can learn from these books. Like, I did write down some stuff from these books about certain things, but, like, mostly they are just absolute garbage. When it comes to Brovkin's political views, he praises Menshevism against Bolshevism. Then he praises Ryutin against Stalin. Ryutin was a right oppositionist, maybe the most extreme right oppositionist. He wrote, there's a document called the Ryutin Platform. The Ryutin Platform basically just says that they have to overthrow Stalin. So he praises Menshevism, he praises the right opposition, but of course his actual views are much more right-wing than those even. Brovkin also praises Deng Xiaoping. On page 106, he says that Deng Xiaoping was very smart because he got rid of planned economy and restored capitalism. And Brovkin also writes very favorably about Khrushchev. You know, it's not really very high praise. If this like hardline anti-communist supports you, then you're probably doing something wrong. Interestingly, Brovkin also supports this or perpetuates this long debunked theory of a so-called liberal opposition against Stalin, or a liberal opposition in the Politburo, or liberal bloc in the Politburo, led by Kirov. The other alleged members of this liberal bloc were Kuibyshev or Johnny Kidze, and maybe some others, but such a bloc never existed. I'm not sure where it originally comes from, but it's just one of those weird things, like one of those weird myths that existed for a while in the Cold War, but it was eventually debunked. Eventually, historians realized that Kirov was not a liberal, that Kirov was in agreement with Stalin about pretty much everything, and that Kuibyshev was much more radical than Stalin. I just think that it's illustrative of something, that this stuff that has been like debunked for so many years, that Brovkin still like perpetuates it. So either he just doesn't care, or like maybe he's just not keeping up with what's happening. But like, is that really possible? Because like this liberal bloc stuff was debunked already in the 80s or 90s. So like maybe he just doesn't care. This idea that Stalin decided to embalm Lenin and like this. He also cites this letter by this Soviet army leader, Yakir, who was part of the Tukhachevsky conspiracy. And like Yakir, he sends this letter to Stalin, and in this letter he says that like, yeah, I was always loyal, but then I became a traitor, and I admit my guilt, and yada yada. And in his secret speech, Khrushchev quotes this same letter, where Khrushchev says that, oh look, Stalin framed Yakir, like Yakir was actually innocent. And then he quotes the letter where it says, I was always loyal. But then he doesn't read the full quote where it says, I was loyal, but then I became a traitor. And this was discovered already a really long time ago, that Khrushchev basically just falsified this quote, that he only read one part of it and didn't read the rest of it, totally deceptively giving the opposite meaning of what it actually says. But Brovkin, he doesn't care. He reads the same falsified quote. It's either just extreme dishonesty or just extreme, I don't know, like, what would be the term, like incompetence. Okay, I actually went and looked it up because I wanted to give you a more concrete idea of what the letter actually says. And also, it wasn't read by Khrushchev, it was read by his collaborator Zhukov. I misremembered that, although maybe Khrushchev does also quote it at a later date, but anyway, this is what the letter actually says. So, quote, Dear close comrade Stalin, I dare address you in this way because I have told everything, and it seems to me that I am once more that honorable warrior devoted to the party, state and people that I was for many years. The words once more were censored, so he didn't read those. And that is obviously because the words once more imply that he was devoted to the state and the party and the people, but then he stopped doing that, and now he's once more. So Zhukov removed those. He continues that I am once more that honorable warrior devoted to the party, state and people that I was for many years. All my conscious life has been passed in selfless honorable work in the sight of the party and its leaders. And now begins the part that Zhukov also cut out. He says, then I fell into a nightmare, into the irreparable horror of treason. The investigation is finished, the indictment of treason to the state has been presented to me, I have admitted my guilt, I have repented completely, unquote. So imagine trying to turn this, a letter which is a clear admission of guilt. He says, yeah, I was loyal, then I became a traitor, and now I'm trying to be loyal again, I have admitted everything. Like, imagine trying to turn this, which is an admission of guilt, into a denial of guilt. That's the level of fabrication that these people need to resort to. Brovkin also cites Khrushchev to prove that Stalin really badly bungled World War II, and that Stalin, like when the Germans invaded, Stalin just didn't react for like days, didn't do anything. That's something that Khrushchev invented and that Khrushchev said in his secret speech. It's also been debunked for a really long time. And when I say debunked, I don't mean that communists have debunked it. I mean even anti-communists and non-communists have debunked it. Because there are some anti-communist historians who, they don't want to use propaganda that is this stupid. They want to use smarter propaganda. Brovkin also makes errors about weird, like just completely basic stuff. Like for example, he says, quote, in 1942, during the dangerous period for the survival of the Soviet Union, Sergei Eisenstein made a film Alexander Nevsky, unquote. And I don't know why he says that. Why does he think the film is from 1942? Because the film is actually from 1938. He specifically says that it's in 1942 during the dangerous period for the survival of the Soviet Union. Like, as if it was specifically made for that period. But it's from 1938. Like, not that it's a big deal necessarily, it's just odd. Also, the film doesn't look like it was made during the war. Like, during the war, they made very basic movies because they didn't have as many resources to spend on film productions. Brovkin's discussion of the Brezhnev era is, of course, it's one-sided, it's from a reactionary point of view, but some of the stuff he says is actually correct. Basically, there's this idea that some capitalist historians also kind of accept, and I think it is probably true, is this idea that Stalin he threatened the power of the people who wanted to become privileged bureaucrats, and Stalin made like a lot of demands from them. He said like, you have to achieve fast industrialization, you have to achieve this, that, and the other thing. Whereas people who were careerists, they just wanted not so many demands, and they wanted security. They want to be like, I want to become a career bureaucrat, and I want to be secure in that position. Whereas Stalin is constantly, saying I have to achieve all these difficult tasks, and if I don't, then he's going to demote me and he's going to promote somebody to replace me. And if I steal state money, or if I embezzle money, or become corrupt, then I'm going to be arrested. Whereas under Khrushchev and also under Brezhnev, Khrushchev kind of told the careerists, support me and I'll just give you whatever you want. Like, you can become secure in your position and I'm not going to make such tough demands and whatnot. And then under Brezhnev, like Brovkin, he says that Brezhnev initiated a policy called, I think it was called stability of cadres, or which basically just meant that people who were in power, they just became more solidly in power, and it was harder to remove them. And I think that created these bureaucratic cliques, and that explains, like, well, why everybody under Brezhnev, like all the leaders, they're so old, because they're not being replaced by newer ones. The people who are in power, they just stay in power, nothing can really challenge them, and they just become more and more corrupt, and then that eventually leads to, a bunch of them staying in power even after the fall of the Soviet Union. Brovkin's discussion of Gorbachev is also, very anti-communist and pro-capitalist, but it has some useful information. And then lastly, he talks about Putin, where again, it just gets quite silly. Like, Brovkin says that Russia actually never became really capitalist, but continues, quote-unquote, Bolshevik criminality. in the form of crony capitalism. So he says that Russia is not really capitalist, it's crony capitalist, which he considers the same as Bolshevism. And he says that Putin is just a continuation of Leninism, just in the form of Slavophilism. And some of the stuff he says is a bit interesting, like he talks about Dugin and Dugin's philosophy. You know, he says that Putin originally was a westernizer, but then he became a Slavophile. Westernizers and Slavophiles were these trends in Russian politics in 1800s. But even though he says that, he's actually still quite favorable to Putin. Like, Brovkin doesn't really criticize Putin all that harshly. He's much more pro-Putin than your average Western historian, I would imagine. But anyway, that's that. I've been talking for a really long time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.